Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues now, and make sure to stay tuned to catch me, Mike Gallagher, coming up at 9, only on AM 560, The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. The full press is on. We talked about the Rod Blagojevich op-ed in Monday's Wall Street Journal, and now here we are at the end of the week, and Dinesh D'Souza has been pardoned, and Martha Stewart and Rod Blagojevich could be next up to perhaps send a message across the bow of Trump's enemies, perhaps send an indication to Trump allies of his willingness to use his presidential pardon / commutation power to advance his interests, to send political messages as well as to reward allies.
Well, yesterday, President Trump spoke with reporters on Air Force One while he was heading to Texas. And rarely does he invite reporters on his plane into his office, but he did. And everything was kind of off the record. They were just chatting. Then he said, but I do want you to put one thing on the record. And he talked about pardoning Martha Stewart, fellow Apprentice alum, and also Rod Blagojevich. And what he said about the governor, he said 18 years, I think, really unfair. For being stupid and saying things that every other politician, that many
years.
I know. Well, it is 14 years, but that's what he told reporters. So they kept saying, he said 18, and that he was sent to prison for being stupid and saying things that every other politician, that many other politicians say. That's verbatim. And he said, I am seriously thinking about not pardoning, but I am seriously thinking of curtailment for Blagojevich. Mm-hmm. The exact words that came out of his mouth.
Well, to get reaction to that presidential pronouncement, we're pleased to be joined again by Robert Blagojevich, Rod Blagojevich's brother. You'll remember he was originally indicted in the first trial of Rod Blagojevich. When that jury hung, he was not retried. He ultimately wrote a book called Fundraiser A, My Fight for Freedom and Justice. And Rod Blagojevich joins us now. Thanks so much for being with us again. We appreciate it.
Good morning. Thank you.
So how do you react to the news that your brother may have his sentence commuted?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm hopeful that if President Trump is gracious enough to commute, pardon, whatever the technical term might be, to shorten Rod's stay in prison, I think it would be a wonderful thing for Rod to be reunited with his family and back to get on with his life.
Yeah, where were you when you heard the news, and how did you hear it?
Yeah, I was in my car driving to Huntsville, Alabama on business, and I heard it on the Business Channel. I mean, I was thrown back when I heard it. Cautiously optimistic, of course, and completely changed my day. I'm very happy, but sober at the same time.
Now, after the ordeal that you went through with your brother when you kind of came on to help him with his reelection campaign and the fundraising for that campaign, if I'm remembering correctly from one of the last times we spoke, you were estranged from your brother, and I wonder if that relationship has been repaired or there's still some estrangement, but obviously he's your brother, so you don't want him to be in prison any longer than he has to be.
Yeah, I've got to chuckle. No, we have not made any contact really since Rod and I spoke last, just before he went to prison. But that truly is, as you said, beside the point. I'm his brother. I love him, and I really want him to be reunited with his family and get on with his life. So whatever issues he and I have are secondary to him getting his freedom.
Do you think that he did anything wrong? Do you think that he committed crimes that he should have been imprisoned?
Here's what I know. I sat through that first trial, and I saw how lopsided the prosecution was allowed to present evidence, and how, at that time, Judge Zagel gave them every opportunity to show one side of it. And when it was time for Rod's team in the second trial to show evidence that was exculpatory of the accusations and all the stupid talk, I would say, that Rod is guilty of, that was presented to the jury, it was, to me, a travesty. If you heard all the tapes that I heard getting ready for trial, you would come to a very different conclusion than what has ultimately played out. I'm a veteran. I pay my taxes. I believed in our justice system until I was a part of it and learned how corrupt and one-sided it is. And if the prosecution has an agenda to go after someone,
Yep.
as they did with my brother, and ultimately me as a pawn, and wiretap you and surveil you for 50 days, they will make a federal crime out of it.
Wow.
And so I am so sobered by what's happened to us that I wrote the book. I've spoken to law schools, done many things in the Chicago area, trying to get the word out that I really sincerely believe our civil liberties are at stake here. And if you see what's going on in Washington, D.C. with the Mueller investigation, and I see many of the same tactics with associates of President Trump's being treated the same way that I was, just to be used to get leverage to go after their target, which in my case was my brother, it's un-American, and it's concerning to me, and we really better wake up. I mean, there's so many signals here that indicate that the American public blindly is just surrendering its civil liberties to powers in Washington, D.C. and other centers around the country that think that have agendas and can more freely pursue them.
Yeah, I mean,
Real
Department of
concern.
Justice, has a 96% conviction rate?
It does. There's a reason for that. It's such a lopsided system. And again, like I said in Rod's case and mine, they just show one side and they won't let the other side in. And I'm being very honest when I say, if you heard all the tapes, you would conclude that there was definitely no intent on my brother's part to commit a crime, to take money, or anything other than do the right thing for the people of Illinois. I strongly stand by that.
But don't you think that's why President Trump has a possible soft spot in his heart for your brother, because he knows what he's going through?
There's a part of that. I mean, I think President Trump is the ultimate political disruptor, just like, Lyft, Uber, Airbnb are in the marketplace. And he's in Washington and legitimately sees that the place is broken and needs to be kind of recalibrated. And so when he sees a wrong, which you can say this recent one of Dinesh D'Souza or Scooter Libby, who was prosecuted also by Patrick Fitzgerald, that he's pardoned those people, they were wrong. And I would argue, ultimately, my brother was wrong. He was not able to provide his defense because Judge Zagel didn't allow his tapes to be presented into trial. A travesty.
Do you think that the effort, the Patty Blagojevich effort with the interviews in Fox News, I mentioned at the outset the op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, going through the appeals process, exhausting the appeals process, but then taking the case into the media as much as she can. This has been a sort of coordinated, purposeful political campaign with President Trump as the audience.
Yeah, I can't, if it's a political campaign to reach out to President Trump, I don't see it that way. What I do know is this. From just before President Obama left office, there was an effort, back-channel effort, to reach out to him and seek his humanity in a case that was clearly an unjust one, to see if he would do something for my brother. I reached out to him, and I know there were processes that were in place that formally put a commutation package before him. I spoke with a local congressperson who I won't name, who was my point of contact, who gave me feedback that President Obama did not like Rod. Don't get your hopes up. And, if he gets it on his desk, he'll review it. So it began way back then, and it continued on justifiably. And not only whatever you've noted here with Patty and Rod doing what they've done, I've been quietly working through channels to reach out to President Trump through people that I know who are close to him. And so it's been a concerted family effort, although we aren't coordinated at all. It's a family effort to right a wrong, an absolute wrong, that if it happened to any American family, they'd be as outraged as I am right now.
Yeah, so you've mentioned, we don't have to name names, but certain lawmakers in Washington, D.C., that have been reaching out to Trump. What have you been hearing back? Anything?
I'll keep that to myself.
Okay.
but thanks for asking.
Okay.
And you know, you mentioned at the outset you're guardedly optimistic but sober. You recognize that while Trump raising the issue publicly is encouraging, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to follow through and do what you'd like to see him do. So if the commutation doesn't happen, then, you know, what's the next step? Do you communicate at all with Patty about what's happening or not happening, or what you're trying to do versus what she's trying to do? Do you kind of, you know, brainstorm together?
Yeah, great question, and I don't know that a disappointment like that would unite us in any way. I'm always open to do whatever I can to help Patty, and of course my brother. So the ball's in their court on that issue. But just more globally, if he were not to do something, it would obviously be a very sad, heartbreaking outcome. But we won't give up. I mean, I know I won't. And, you know, who knows? I really believe that President Trump is a guy who sees things that people who were wronged in the system should be given some kind of relief. And so I'm very hopeful and cautiously optimistic. But again, as I said earlier, sober. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, but President Trump has been on a so-called pardon parade, and I don't think he's going to walk this back. I mean, the fact that he brought the reporters in, said everything's off the record, then said, but you can put this on the record. I may pardon Martha Stewart and Rod Blagojevich. Both happen to be, you know, alumni of The Apprentice. Do you think, since he knows them, that helps with his decision-making process?
I would say it sure can't hurt, certainly. But, you know, until it's done and the ink is dry, there are no high fives coming from me.
Yeah.
Mm. And it's just going back to your experience that you sort of described, and you do obviously more detail in your book, Fundraiser A. So my opinion, just so you know, and I think we've talked about this before, is that, you know, Rod was guilty of crimes, maybe not the selling of the Senate seat, but there were other crimes. But I always thought your prosecution was wrong. You should have never been prosecuted in the first place, even though you weren't prosecuted in the second trial. And I just wanted, to your point about the justice system and being stacked against you, you know, what it cost you. You were a successful businessman, I think, in Tennessee somewhere. You came up to do this thing with your brother to help him. And so what it cost you, both kind of financially and just in terms of, you know, your time and quality of life for that period of time.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. It was a life changer. And I have cast it as a David and Goliath. You don't realize until you get in that courtroom and see all those prosecutors, FBI agents, IRS agents, just all lined up to go after you. So it's clearly you're the underdog. But as I went through the process, the thing that drove me, other than support of my very loving family and close friends, is that I was not going to give the government the benefit of the doubt of destroying me, whether I was convicted or not, but never destroy my spirit. And so fortunately, I was able to testify effectively, and then ultimately the government dropped their charges after playing games to try to keep me engaged before they finally dropped the charges. I wrote about that in my book. I call that they played chicken with my life, which is so dirty and underhanded. It's amazing to me that this is our government. But after they dropped their charges, it took me about 1.5 years to get my financial footing back. It cost me close to $1 million to defend myself. And I continued to not give them the satisfaction of destroying my spirit, my belief in myself, and my belief in my community. And for sure, all the people that supported me are even more special than they were before. And the other thing, guys, you'll learn is who your friends really are.
Oh, yeah.
And I was very fortunate after I got back to Nashville, the unanimity of support for me, and I had major issues in my business, and local banks that I'd had relationships with gave me a break. And they said, look, you need a break. We'll work with you and help you restructure some of the stuff that you've got going. So life is, I've regained my stride, had the book, had a real opportunity to speak all over the country, talk to law schools, and kind of re-nourish my spirit and get my stride back. So fortunately, you know, I'm stronger, better, smarter for what happened to me ultimately.
So it sounds like you miss Chicago politics. He is Robert Blagojevich, brother of Rod Blagojevich. The book, if you want to check out his story, going kind of walking back almost a decade ago. Fundraiser A. Robert, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro